An engineered infection could help create medications, immunizations, and indicative tests, however, could likewise be utilized as a bioweapon. As nations scramble to contain the novel coronavirus spreading far and wide, researchers in Switzerland are purposefully making a greater amount of the savage infection. The main contrast is that their rendition is engineered. Behind the entryways of a high-security lab in a small Swiss town, specialists at the University of Bern reproduced the coronavirus, officially known as SARS-CoV-2, in only 7 days utilizing yeast, a distributed genome, and male request DNA. The engineered infection, which they detail in another paper presented on the preprint server Bior-Ziv, could enable more labs to create medications, antibodies, and symptomatic tests for the coronavirus. However, the capacity to rapidly make an infection without any preparation additionally raises worries that the procedure could be utilized to make natural weapons. Researchers regularly study an infection by disconnecting it from a wiped-out patient's cells and developing it in a lab dish. In any case, specialists have attempted to get their hands on the coronavirus. At the point when an episode of an ailment occurs far away, it can take a long time for labs to gain admittance to physical examples. In these circumstances, analysts may go to an engineered rendition of an infection, otherwise called an irresistible clone, so they can begin considering it sooner. Making an engineered rendition can be a more down-to-earth alternative than requesting a risky infection through the mail, and it permits analysts to evade a ton of administrative loops. There are import rules and extraordinary grants engaged with transportation and getting pathogens. Aggregately, every one of those things can take a gigantic measure of time, says David Evans, a virologist at the University of Alberta whose group brought caution up in 2017 for making an engineered rendition of the terminated horsepox infection, a relative of the smallpox infection. On the off chance that you need to begin working with the infection as fast as could be expected under the circumstances, it's occasionally quicker and less complex just to make it yourself. To make an infection, you need guidelines on the best way to collect it. On January 10, a Chinese gathering gave a plan of the infection to researchers around the globe by distributing a draft of the coronavirus genome on an open get-to site. The Swiss group behind the new paper, drove by virologist Volker Thiel, promptly got the opportunity to work. They submitted a request of coronavirus DNA with GenScript, a New Jersey-based organization that makes and offers manufactured hereditary material to specialists. Organizations like GenScript print out DNA in short sections that should be amassed into a full genome. After 3 weeks, the Swiss group had the vast majority of the DNA pieces they expected to begin reproducing the coronavirus genome. Now and again researchers do this by hand, which can take a ton of time. To speed this up, the group embedded these sections into brewer's yeast cells, which amassed the DNA parts like unique pieces utilizing a characteristic procedure called recombination. This procedure framed the coronavirus genome inside the yeast. It worked flawlessly, similar to a Swiss watch. Next, the specialists expected to change over the coronavirus genome from DNA to a related atom called RNA. Coronavirus is a RNA infection, which means its hereditary material is RNA instead of DNA. From that point forward, they made duplicates of the engineered infection and found that the infection particles could taint monkey cells, a substitute for human cells. This demonstrated the manufactured coronavirus was a devoted duplicate of the first. Through and through, the procedure took 7 days after the group got the DNA via the post office. It worked splendidly, similar to a Swiss watch, says Jörg Jors, a creator on the paper and executive of the Institute of Veterinary Bacteriology at the University of Bern. Angela Rasmussen, a virologist at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, says having an engineered imitation of the infection can assist scientists with making sense of how to stop its spread. Having the infection itself is extremely basic to planning and testing drugs that can possibly enhance the viral contamination, she says. Specialists can likewise utilize hereditary building to change the infection to see whether certain transformations make it pretty much destructive. Having more secure variants is especially useful with the goal that analysts don't get contaminated while contemplating the infection, says Rasmussen. Jor says it cost about $30,000 to buy the DNA sections, and in a couple of years, it will most likely be significantly less expensive. DNA incorporating used to be costly and difficult, however organizations like GenScript, Integrated DNA Technology, and Twist Bioscience have mechanized the procedure. The capacity to rapidly and efficiently combine DNA has prompted fears that researchers could mix up hereditarily built pathogens, which could escape from the lab and contaminate general society. Rasmussen, in any case, says individuals shouldn't stress a lot over that chance since research to make an infection increasingly hazardous, known as addition of capacity examen, is profoundly controlled. Thiel's group had extraordinary consent from the Swiss government to complete its examination in a high-regulation lab that has explicit security necessities. Just like someone could go into their lab one day and state, "I will adjust this infection clone to make it increasingly transmissible," she says. In 2014, the U.S. government suspended comparative research after lab laborers at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention were possibly presented to live Bacillus anthracis, and workers at the Food and Drug Administration ran over overlooked vials of the smallpox immunization. A couple of years prior, two research bunches reported that they had made the H5N1 flying creature influenza progressively infectious in ferrets. In 2017, the legislature discharged new rules for these kinds of trials. Presently, researchers proposing such research must experience a broad survey to get endorsement. Such addition of capacity research could help general well-being specialists take measures to forestall and respond to pandemics. Researchers initially made an engineered infection in 2002, when they remade a live polio infection utilizing synthetic concoctions and freely accessible hereditary data. That work was really subsidized by the Pentagon as a component of a program to create biowarfare countermeasures. With the assent of unregulated do-it-without anyone else's help science and resident science labs, some concern that imaginative biohackers could concoct fatal pathogens in their carports and inadvertently or deliberately discharge them. In any case, Evans doesn't believe that is likely. "It's still not actually that simple," he says. "It takes a ton of test aptitude, which isn't clear from perusing these papers." He's increasingly worried that a state entertainer would utilize engineered science to make a bioweapon in the lab and discharge it to an adversary populace. A legislature or an administration lab well furnished with educated researchers could reproduce the entirety of this stuff. As of now, there is no proof that the ebb and flow episode is the after-effect of weaponization. Organizations that print and sell DNA give one check to potential awful on-screen characters. DNA union organizations have met up to build up some guidelines on who they offer DNA to and what successions of DNA they sell. They screen clients and vet quality requests with the goal that arrangements of perilous pathogens don't wind up in an inappropriate hands. Just approved labs can get DNA to make the most deadly ones. Yet, as making DNA gets progressively simpler, quicker, and less expensive, numerous labs could before long can print DNA in-house, making the chance of making pathogens much increasingly doable.